Okay, good morning. Yeah, genetically modified plants or genetically modified organisms, that's something that people have a lot of strong opinions about. And what I will talk about in this speech is actually to tell you that it's, although people have very strong opinions, it's very hard to tell whether a plant is a GMO or whether it's not a GMO. And I will start talking about plant breeding in general, as you probably know. I mean, all of the plants that we cultivate and eat, really, they are results of a really centuries of plant breeding. And I will give you an example here, starting with cabbage. Wild cabbage is growing in this southern Europe, and people have been cultivating and eating this for thousands of years. And so sometime during this process, farmers identified plants that had some genetic defects that looked different than the others. When this was done, somewhere a farmer found brassica that instead of making branches, side shoots, they got a mutation that made these shoots could not elongate. So instead it ended up being small balls. That is what we today call Brussels sprouts, because this farmer, he took seeds from this particular individual, and he saved them, and these seeds have the same trait. And that's, now we eat the offspring of that. Another farmer somewhere found a plant where the stem was swelling up like a ball that became kohlrabi. Another farmer somewhere found a plant that instead of making inflorescence actually made a big white tumor-like structure. That's what we today are eating as cauliflower. So all these things, all these mutations that have been kept by farmers, they are sort of now resulting in the food that we eat today. Just like this little broccoli here. So I put it here. That's the result of centuries of plant breeding. At this time, people didn't actually know what they were doing. I mean, the farmer that picked this Brussels sprout in the beginning, he didn't understand that he was doing breeding, he just did it. And what it was really exploiting, that's the genetic variation that exists between plants, individuals, and between humans. Of course, we all know that there are genetic differences. You probably know roughly what is a gene. We have DNA in our cells, and the DNA is sort of giving us different properties. So we have about 30,000 genes. This is just a picture of two of them somewhere on the DNA strand. And you know, for instance, the color of our eyes are determined by our genes. Those of you who have brown eyes, you have a protein encoded by a certain gene that is producing a brown pigment in your iris. That's why you have brown eyes. I have blue eyes. I have a mutation in this particular gene, so I cannot produce this brown pigment, and that's why I have blue eyes. So that's the way how genes are working. And as I said, people did breeding without knowing anything about this. And the first person that actually started to understand the laws of genetics, that was Gregor Mendel. That was in this monastery garden in Brno, was counting peas, finding out which were green, how many were yellow. And he elucidated the laws of genetics and really made the basis of science-based plant breeding, which since then has been very efficiently producing new varieties and new food that we're eating. That happened in the late 19th century. In the 1920s, plant geneticists understood that instead of just relying on the variation that they found there out in the field, they can start making additional variation by different tricks. People realized that if you expose seeds to large amounts of radioactive radiation, you will induce mutations. You can also do it in other ways. You can add the chemicals that are really cancerogenic and mutagenic for us. And this is sort of went into a new era of plant breeding that gave rise to a lot of new plants that we're eating today. What's happening in reality here in detail is that if, for instance, take the example with radiation, if you expose a plant to radiation, you will see there's something comes, and it destroys the DNA, and you get a break, and then the plant responds by repairing this. Otherwise, of course, it would die if it would get a break of the plant. But this is what's happening by radiation, and then you lose a little bit of DNA. And if this piece of DNA has a specific function, you will get a plant with a different property. This has, for instance, been done when red grapefruits were created. Grapefruit seeds were irradiated with high amounts of radiation. Seeds were sown out. Somewhere, one of these seeds produced a red grapefruit. And then, since most of us, including us, I guess you also, think that red grapefruit taste a little bit better, a little bit sweeter than the others. And since that has become one of the varieties. So we keep it there. I mean, we have a lot of other things. Actually, also brought pepper. I mean, this is the offspring. Chili peppers are very strong. You don't eat them like this. Somewhere a chili pepper got a mutation in the gene that causes them to accumulate a lot of strong flavor. The offspring of that became the sweet peppers. And all these plants, we can grow them in our gardens, we can buy them in our shops, and there is really no restriction. We don't need to have a permit from anyone to grow broccoli in our garden. Then, about 30 years ago, scientists realized that there is a bacterium named agrobacterium that when it infects plants in real life it produces tumors. But it does this by introducing a little bits of its own DNA into the plant DNA. We don't want tumors, but if we take away the piece of DNA that's causing the tumors and instead add other genes that we would like to introduce to the plant, then the bacteria will do the job. And the result of this is a genetically modified plant. So that's sort of the definition of genetically modified plants. People started to get worried about that. Maybe there are certain risks associated with this. And there was a legislation set aside in most countries in the world to regulate this. So, and it separated these ones, sort of the conventionally bred plants, from the sort of novel ones that was thought to have a much stricter regulation. Since then, we've been using this in science for now 30 years. And our favorite plant in basic science is actually this little creature. It's named Arabidopsis. So there are many good things with this, but one of them is if we would like to make a genetically modified Arabidopsis, we actually just take the agrobacterium, add a little soap, we dip it down there, and then we take it up, and then we have genetically modified plants. I can't do it to you because this is strictly forbidden. So I'm not even allowed to bring a genetically modified plant. Now we have to pretend that this one is genetically modified. And then I put it on this side of this. So now we have, this is the situation that we have now since many years. These ones are allowed to grow by anyone without any restriction. And this in reality is grown by, it's almost forbidden to grow anywhere. So many people have over the years been very upset, worried about this, upset about this. There are protests around the world and so on. They actually could do it because there is a legal definition of this. You could say that you're against this. If you would be worried about red grapefruits or sweet peppers and so, it would actually be a problem because there is no definition to tell them apart from all other plants. So, but then over the years, we have learned a lot of this. There's been subject of enormous amount of scientific studies. And for instance, we have learned that there is actually, I mean, science is crystal clear. There is no bigger risk or dangers involved in producing these plants than producing these plants. All science academies and big science organizations in the world have said the same. So there is no scientific reason to have a division like this, but we have one. And the problem is, of course, that since we have one, it's very hard to make a change to it. The only change that you can imagine here, they are both have been impossible in two ways, because if you would put the border here, there won't be anything for us to eat. Because basically all food that we have in that case would be forbidden. And we can't put the borderline here, because then people will get upset because they're also worried about that this may be dangerous. So that's why we've been, for many decades, been having a situation that we have either or. And in my own research, we're looking at photosynthetic light harvesting. We try to understand how the sunlight is harvested by the plant. And we have, for instance, identified a plant that is lacking a protein that we call PSPS, which is kind of a safety valve in photosynthesis. If too much light comes on the plant, this sort of safely takes away the plant. Otherwise, it will get burned and won't be so fit. So we have mutants that have been exposed by radiation, where the whole gene has been missing. If you don't have the gene there, you don't have any protein, and that's just a PSPS-less plant. And we have mutants that were generated by putting a DNA of agrobacterium in the middle of the gene. In this way, we destroy the gene, and the net result is really the same for us. You get plants without PSPS. So in science, these are equivalents, but not in terms of legislation, because this is a GMO because we have used agrobacterium, and this is not the GMO because we have not used agrobacterium. And as scientists, this is a bit ridiculous, but this is the way it's been. Now, since a few years, we have an additional tool in biology. We have this genome editing tool called CRISPR-Cas. So now we can design mutations instead of just relying on radioactivity, breaking DNA somewhere random. We can make specific breaks exactly on, these are called the genetic scissors. We can induce a break where we want, and the plant, of course, responds by repairing it. And in this way, we have, in fact, made another Arabidopsis that really is exactly like this one's up here. We've taken away a piece of the DNA. We have not added anything, because the definition of GMO is that you actually have another piece of DNA that's been added to the plant that was not there before. Here we haven't added anything. The net result is just that we've taken away a little piece of it. So then the question is this a GMO or not? And this is something that scientists and regulators have been pondering on for many years in Europe by now. And these are seeds of mutants, CRISPR mutants. So then, of course, it can't be half GMO. It can't be here. It must either be put there or it must be put there. And if it's put here, everyone can grow it without any restriction. If it's put here, no one can grow it anywhere in reality because it's forbidden by the legislation. So we asked the authorities about this. Long after a few years, finally, the Swedish authorities said that the way that they interpret the EU law is that this cannot be regarded as GMOs because they don't contain any foreign DNA, which is good for us because then this will mean that now I can plant these ones and do experiments on them or do this summer, which we will do. However, the EU has said that, well, we will take a decision that will overrule the decision of the national authorities. But we don't know what it will be, and we've been waiting for years for this. So when that will happen, it will actually become a very interesting situation, because these plants that we will have may suddenly become illegal. But the illegal plants are exactly the same as legal plants. So to me, this will create a very interesting thing. So what will happen? I mean, will the police come and say, okay, good luck. Which are the illegal ones, which are the legal ones, because they're identical? And will this thing hold up in court? If the only way that the court can know if a crime has been committed would be if I tell them exactly what the crime would be. But there are very strong voices in Europe that is actually saying that these ones will be regarded as genetically modified. And I would argue that it really doesn't make sense to have a legislation that separates between identical plants, and in particular which legislation that actually depends in the court that someone tells exactly what the crime is in order to be convicted. But we don't know this. The decision has been postponed for years from the EU. But when it will come, it will in fact determine whether modern biology can be used by plant breeders in Europe to develop new plants which use less pesticides, less water and less fertilizer to produce more healthier food. If the decision will be that they will be put here, breeders have to rely on the old techniques. If they will be decided to be put here, there will be then access to the whole toolbox. So therefore, this is not a decision which is important only for me as a scientist, but I would say that it's a decision which is important for mankind. So, thank you.